This is Land of Havilah, Psalm 84, verse 1. For the chief musician on an instrument of Gath, a psalm by the sons of Korah. Comment, an instrument of Gath in verse 1 is from a Hebrew word of uncertain meaning. It could be an instrument, as this translation says, or it could be a musical style, NET translation notes. The psalm is by the sons of Korah in verse 1. It's one of 11 psalms credited to them. Korah was a Levite in Moses' time who staged a rebellion in the desert. God opened a crack in the earth and swallowed him, Numbers 16. But God didn't kill his sons, Numbers 26:11. Eventually, the Levites formed a musical group and named it the Sons of Korah. They might have been actually descended from Korah. The name implies that they took the story of Korah to heart and feared God. What follows in this psalm is a rhapsody on the subject of being in the presence of God, how good and pleasant it is, exhilarating. It's called being in his dwellings in verse 1, in his courts in verses 2 and 10, dwelling in his house in verses 4 and 10, and being in Zion in verse 7. That obviously includes being in the courts of the tabernacle and temple during biblical times, since God inhabited those structures. But it's more than that, since God is omnipresent and makes that presence known anywhere he chooses. Psalm 139, 7-10. The point is the wonder of God manifesting himself to a person, no matter where that person might be. The courts of God could be anywhere as long as God manifests himself. Still in verse 1. How lovely are your dwellings, Yahweh of armies! My soul longs and even faints for the courts of Yahweh. My heart and my flesh cry out for the living God. Yes, the sparrow has found a home and the swallow a nest for herself, where she may have her young near your altars, Yahweh of armies, my King and my God. Blessed are those who dwell in your house. They are always praising you, Selah. Blessed are those whose strength is in you, who have set their hearts on a pilgrimage. Passing through the valley of weeping, they make it a place of springs. Yes, the autumn rain covers it with blessings. They go from strength to strength. Every one of them appears before God in Zion. Yahweh, God of armies, hear my prayer. Listen, God of Jacob, Selah. Behold, God our shield, look at the face of your anointed. For a day in your courts is better than 1,000. I would rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than to dwell in the tents of wickedness. For Yahweh God is a sun and a shield. Yahweh will give grace and glory. He withholds no good thing from those who walk blamelessly. Yahweh of armies, blessed is the man who trusts in you. Comment in verse 2, my soul longs and even faints for the courts of Yahweh. My heart and my flesh cry out for the living God. That was Jesus' attitude. He said, zeal for your house consumes me, John 2:17, and Psalm 69:9. It was a zeal for God, the house being secondary. In verse 3, the sparrow has found a home and the swallow a nest for herself, where she may have her young near your altars. Birds have a certain glory, their beauty, their astounding ability to fly. They speak of the wonder of the Creator. In verse 5, blessed are those who have set their heart on a pilgrimage. The furthest reaches of Israel were 90 or 100 miles from Jerusalem, so from those areas to visit the temple it was a multi-day pilgrimage. Blessed are those who set their heart on that pilgrimage in verse 5, because they're seeking God. In verse 6, passing through the valley of weeping, they make it a place of springs, meaning in their sadness they found refreshing in the courts of the Lord. In verse 6, the autumn rain covers it with blessings. Jerusalem's bone dry May to September, but then the autumn rain is welcome. In verse 6, God's relief from the valley of weeping is a blessing like the autumn rain. In verse 7, they go from strength to strength. God's people are strong day in and day out because of his support. In verse 9, look at the face of your anointed. The anointed in those days were the king and high priest. As part of their induction ceremonies, they had oil poured on the head, which was the anointing. The anointing indicated that God chose them for that position. He was inaugurating them into those positions. So verse 9 is a prayer that God would look at their face, meaning keep an eye out for them, and give them favor and success. Jesus is now the anointed king and high priest, Acts 4:27 and Hebrews 4:14. So this is also a prayer that the Father would give him success. And God has anointed Christians, 2 Corinthians 1:21, so it's also a prayer that God will look on our face and give us favor. Look at the face of your anointed. In verse 10, I'd rather be a doorkeeper in the house of God than to dwell in the tents of the wicked. Let's desire God. A humble position with Him is better than a lofty position among the wicked. In verse 11, God is a sun and shield, meaning He gives light, lifts our spirits, and protects us. In verse 11, He gives grace and glory. In Hebrews 2:10, He brings us into His glory. In verse 11, He withholds no good thing from those who walk blamelessly. From the New Testament, quote, He who didn't spare His own Son, but delivered Him up for us all, how would He not also with Him freely give us all things? Romans 8:32. If He didn't withhold Christ from us, He'll withhold no other good thing. Blessed is the man who trusts in Him in the last verse. Psalm 85 is next.